Hey farmers and landowners, this is Damian Mason coming at you with a question. Have you ever had disease or pest problems cost you money by reducing your yield? Well, of course you have. We fight this, right? That's what production agriculture is all about, is working as best we can to put out a great yield, and to do so oftentimes you've got to overcome disease and pests. The problem is we usually treat those diseases and pests after the problem, right? So what if you could do it proactively? What if you had a tool that gave you predictive analytics so that you would know if you have things like corn rootworm, soybean cyst nematode, sudden death syndrome? Well, you have that tool now. It's from Pattern Ag. Pattern Ag doing predictive soil analytics way beyond just the old days of sticking a probe in the ground every few acres and saying, hey, wow, we got some nitrogen deficiency here. They'll let you know if you have pest and disease. Go to pattern.ag. That's www.pattern.ag to learn more about this awesome technology and how it can help you increase your yields by taking care of diseases and pests before they cause you harm. Well, hey there. Thanks for joining me on this journey known as the Business of Agriculture podcast. Really, it's more than just a podcast. It's also videos. That's right. It's on my YouTube channel. Go to the Damian Mason channel on YouTube. Very easy. Just type in Damian Mason channel and watch the stuff there. Also, I'm on Acres TV. That's right. The Hefty brothers up in Baltic, South Dakota created a new media platform known as Acres TV. You can go there and sign up for free and see all of my stuff there. But I enjoy the fact that you're listening, and I never, in 29 years of running my own business, starting out way back when, I've never forgotten that I work for an audience, and you are my audience, so I very much appreciate it. Yes, if I sound a little mushy, it's because I just got done with the holidays, and you know how that is. You do a little reflecting, you look back, and you say, hey, man, I'm in my 29th year, almost 3 decades down that I've been doing this, starting out way back in political comedy to today. Well, I never forgotten that, again, I work for other people's money, and I work for other people's ears and attention span. So I appreciate you giving me yours, and I'm going to make it worth your while. Today we're talking about corporate-ization, consolidation, and the realities of commoditization as it pertains to production agriculture. Why did this subject come up? And I'm probably, by the way, I'm going to tell you right now, as you know, I'm a straight shooter, and I always am out here giving you my real, honest to God thoughts based on my research and the data that I dig up and share with you. This one might piss off a couple people that are old school because I'm going to attack. By the way, that's the media buzz phrase the last 5 years, that Donald Trump attacked so-and-so or Biden's people attacked this. When the Japanese imperial forces dropped bombs on Pearl Harbor and killed 3,000 servicemen and women, that was an attack. Disagreeing with somebody is hardly an attack, okay? So I'm not attacking anyone, but I might get attacked when I share with you some of my real thoughts about this, because it's a hot button. It has been for a long, long time. Where did this come from? Okay, what I'm going to talk about is, quite frankly, this idea, this notion that you can't start out as a young person in production agriculture anymore these days. I have been hearing this, mind you, I'm 53 years old, I swear to God, since somewhere in my grade school years. Maybe at my first 4-H meeting that I attended, maybe at the tractor maintenance club meeting that I attended, where some old farmers were standing around in the workshop or in the mechanic shop of a John Deere dealership. I can tell you that I have heard this lament for a long, long time. I'm a question whether it's even accurate. Okay, how'd this come up? I was a guest on another podcast called The Ranching Reboot recently. And the host of this, nice guy, Brian, nice guy, and I told him I'm going to disagree with you about some stuff, and I do, and I did. And you can go back and listen to that episode if you want. Find the Ranching Reboot podcast and type in Damian Mason. But the point is, don't go there now. Stay listening to this, because I'm going to give you the summary, and I'm going to go a lot more in depth on this subject. He's one of these guys that is not uncommon in agriculture. They said, well, what do you think about this corporate-ization of agriculture? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. Corporations like the ones that sponsor me? Corporations like, that sponsor my podcast? Corporations that make the stuff that we use, from the chemistry to the fertilizer to the tractors to the cell phones, trucks? What are you talking about? He says, no, the fact that young people can't get into production agriculture anymore. And I said, oh, God, not this again. All right. This has been a statement that I've heard. Again, I've been hearing this at least 40 years, 45 years. from somebody, from some chorus of people within our industry. And so I've heard it so much that I thought I'm going to do a whole damn podcast on this subject. The corporate-ization, which by the way is not a word, that's okay. Corporate-ization of production agriculture. In a nutshell, it might be a complaint that is unfounded, or it might be a complaint that is actually a complaint that others could have a lot more to complain about than agriculture. Now, we don't like to hear that because we like to do this thing where we like pat ourselves in the back, how hard we work, and what great stewards of land we are and all that. And we are. And I'm a farm guy, obviously. I own farm ground, was raised on a farm. I'm all about that. But I want to kind of go about this whole thing from a different angle and say, all right, here's the reality. Production agriculture in general is producing a commodity. And if you are going to produce a commodity, size and economies of scale will always win out. Whether I'm making locomotives to haul the freight on the rail, by the way, like General Electric is one of the biggest. I'm not sure who still is, but years ago I worked in Pennsylvania and they manufactured them in Erie, Pennsylvania. So I learned a little bit about the locomotive industry. You know what? There's not 100 million people out there manufacturing locomotives in their backyard, because it's a commodity and it favors size and scale. Asphalt shingles. Just ask yourself this question. Could a young person get into the manufacture, distribution, and selling of asphalt shingles? Again, it's a branded product. If you go to Home Depot, they'll tell you this brand's better than the others. But in general, there's a few major manufacturers, call it like Owens Corning, for example. And you'd say, well, hell no, you can't compete against them. There's only 10 manufacturers, and it's a commodity product, and you got to have huge factories and, go. That is what we really need to use as our comparison. When we hear the lament, how difficult it is for young people to start out in production agriculture, say, hey, you know what else would be really hard? It'd be really hard. Because I'm talking about commodities here. I'm talking about if you're wanting to be 22-year-old kid, fresh out of college, 18-year-old kid, fresh out of high school, 25-year-old after your first couple of years of working corporate America, want to start your own business. You say, okay, you know what? The business I want to start making corn. I want to start making soybeans, wheat. I want to start making even beef, milk. All of these products are traded, as you well know, on the Board of Trade, the CME group, right? And so look at the stuff that is traded as a commodity and then say, wait a minute, what's unique about this is that a bunch of them, like the stuff we eat, are still really produced by smaller operators. But then if you go to aluminum, if you wanted to buy a futures contract on copper, you're talking about like Phelps Dodge or Freeport McMoran. These are companies I know about because I live in Arizona part-time and we used to be a copper state, right? But the point is, and still are to a certain degree, but my reality here is if you are in commodity production, which corn, soybeans, wheat, milk, coffee is, you actually have a leg up. You could still be a small to mid-sized producer and be viable, economically viable in that production. Try doing that with copper pipe. Try doing that with aluminum cans. Try doing that with coal. You see, where I'm going here is we've heard this lament so much, this complaint, this argument. Well, young people can't start out in production agriculture. Well, there might be some truth to that. Why? Because commoditization, which is what we produce, leads to large-scale production, huge capital requirements, and generally low margins. Right now, things are good in agriculture, but if you've been around the block a couple of times, have a few years logged, have a little age to you, you know that this is not always the case, that sometimes in production agriculture, you have years of break even. Sometimes we've had even decades. We've had years on top of years that were losses, and then years of break even before we had years of good profit. In general, and I'm not the only person that's ever going to say this. If you've never heard it before, you need to probably attend more ag meetings where an ag economist talks, but it's quite simply this. In general, the price of an agricultural commodity generally gravitates to cost of production. In other words, the revenue that you receive is essentially about break even with what it costs to produce it. So why then would you expect, and this is where I guess I'm giving you a counterbalance, I'm giving you a perspective from another angle that most of us never think about. If a person came to you that was 22 years old, that just gotten out of college, or 18 years, just got out of high school, and you said, "What are you going to do, young man? Hey, young lady, what are you going to do with yourself? I know you really like agriculture." "Yep, I'm going to start farming." "Oh, are you going to join in an operation that's already in existence, work as an employee?" "Nope, I'm just going to start this business from nothing. I have zero capital, and I'm going to do it." And you'd say, "Well, that's going to be very, very difficult." And then Grandpa might say, "Ain't like it used to be. In the old days, a young person could start out. Can't do that anymore." And again, I'm going to tell you why that's actually close to utter bullshit. Why Grandpa is doing rose-colored lenses and why that's not even true. I'm going to get to that here in a second. But you'll go around the table and you hear how it's not like it used to be. You can't do that anymore, blah, blah. But then imagine if that young person, that 18, 22, 23-year-old person, whatever age, but the point was it was brought up to me, and it's always brought up about young people. So while we're on this, say, what if that 22-year-old sitting at the holiday dinner table said, "What are you going to do with yourself, young lady?" And she says, "I'm going to get into the manufacture of aluminum cans." You say, "Well, what?" There's like 3 companies that do that. For God's sakes, like they have huge manufacturing facilities. They're buying bauxite contracts from mines in Australia and making that stuff into aluminum. And like they're working on like 18% margins. Sometimes they get the shit beat out of them by the big canners, big brewers, let's say, that can then dictate to them what they will pay. How are you thinking you're going to get into the manufacture of aluminum cans? It's a commodity business. It favors size, scale, huge capital requirements, and the margins sometimes suck. Oh, you see, I just compared production agriculture with a bunch of things that you're familiar with. You've drank out of an aluminum can, and do you think that that came from somebody that makes 50 cans a day? Hence the point. Size and scale tends to always be the winning factor in commodity production. And again, I'm not being negative. I'm not being mean. I don't have anything against young people in agriculture, but I'm going to give you now some historical perspective. Because remember a little bit ago, I told you that Grandpa might just be full of shit and looking back at things with rose-colored lenses. Why did I say that? This country was settled in an agrarian fashion. We had homesteading here. We gave away the federal government, different states. I mean, there's been a bunch of different programs. If you go back and read your history, we had a thing where we gave every other quarter section going down a path, if you will, to the railroads to encourage settlement, the westward, shall we say, the westward conquering of the United States of America. Now, if you're a Canadian, listen to this. I'm not going to get into it because I don't know all the history of Canada. But the point is, there was a time when we gave away land, or we gave land to the railroads so that they would go out and invest the money to build the rail so we could get to the West Coast. Okay, that's a true story. And then sometimes those rail companies generally then sold it to a person that wanted to be a farmer. And a young person, let's say, a young person who wanted to start out in farming. And you'd say, okay. And they got it pretty cheap because after all, the railroads didn't pay nothing for it. They would use that money then to justify building their rail. Guess what? Most of those people went broke. This is in the 1800s. Most of the homesteaders did not make it. Most of the people who settled in my home state of Indiana came there young, wanted to start out in production agriculture, didn't make it. Now I'm going back almost 200 years ago. The state of Indiana became a state in 1816. That's right. That's 200 years ago. Let me give you another perspective. We hit peak farm in the United States of America. We hit peak farm, meaning we had the most individual farming entities in 1935. I talk about this in my book, Food Fear, which is really should have been more aptly titled The Past, Present, and Future of Agriculture. Peak farm occurred in 1935 when the country had 6.8 million farming operations and 32 million farm residents. The number of farms and operators has been declining ever since. That's a true story. Right now, we're around 2 million farming operations. 2 million used to be 6.8. Going back 90 years ago, we are at 2. There were 3 million farming operations when I was born in 1969. We have dropped by 50% since then. So this idea that consolidation is something new, or that getting bigger in agriculture is something new, is not really so new after all now, is it? Because again, if you're making number 2 yellow corn, for instance, a commodity, bigger usually favors your bottom line. And I'm not all telling you you've got to go out and be the biggest farmer in the county. I'm just telling you what's been the reality of agricultural history. And I'm refuting this notion that a young person can't get out in this business. A young person starting out in commodity production with no capital would indeed be a struggle. My home state of Indiana, since I just mentioned it, was home to 100 manufacturers of automobiles about a century ago. Turn of the century, 100, 120 years ago. 100 different companies manufactured cars in my home state of Indiana. That's right. Guess how many there are now? Well, there's not necessarily Indiana specific. We have a Toyota plant, we have a Honda plant, we have GM plants. You see where I'm going with this. This has been the nature of anything that becomes commoditized over time. The number of players becomes smaller. In an episode back last summer, and you can look it up, I interviewed a guy named Brett Scotto. He is with a company called Aimpoint Research. Because the reality of these numbers about the farms, and I'm going to consolidation because, again, commoditization generally then leads to consolidation, because once something becomes low margin, high capital, low margin, not as much profit, or not as much profit per unit sold, we should say, then it becomes, okay, we need to have more units because we're going to make less per unit, so let's make a whole bunch more of them, whether you're doing shingles or aluminum cans or copper pipes or bushels of soybeans. It's the same kind of story. As long as it's a commodity, as long as it's something we're just trading on the futures markets, etc., it tends to then be a business that consolidates. Okay? Happening for a long time. Just about everything. Look at your cell phone. How many companies are in the cell phone business versus the first cell phones that came out, 40, 30 years ago? There are now, 4 big companies. Am I saying we're going to get to 4 big farming operations? No, we're not. But Brett Scotto with Aimpoint Research was my guest in the summer. And he says, okay, of the 2 million farms, we got about 170,000 of them, 175,000 of them that we call farms of scale, broader acre, major producers of, and if you're listening to this, you know these numbers roughly, or maybe you don't, but about 175,000 of those 2 million farming operations do really all the heavy lifting. Of the other 2 million farms, the 1.8 million, if you will, 58% of them in the 2017 ag census didn't sell $10,000 worth of agricultural product. So how viable can you be if you want to support your family if you're selling less than $10,000? And that's gross, by the way, gross sales of less than $10,000. So I'm going to refute that. I just want to give you those numbers. Brett Scotto with Aimpoint Research, and that episode's called Who'll Be the Farmer of the Future, says we really think that number's going to come down by 2/3. In other words, we're going to be sitting in a decade from now about 60 to 65,000 farming operations will be of that scale, large scale, doing the bulk of the heavy lifting, producing like 80+% of all ag products here in the United States. Okay. Consolidation is nothing new. I just told you that. 6.8 million farms in 1935. We're down to 2 million now. Consolidation is a result of commoditization. We'll get into some issues of evolution, and I'm also going to tell you some hope, and I'm going to give you some perspective, because that's what I do here on the Business of Agriculture podcast, which, by the way, is sponsored by Truterra. That's right, Truterra. Do you know about them? I'm going to tell you what they want me to tell you. It's kind of cool. Truterra is a company that can help you make money off of other sources, meaning like carbon credits. Truterra is focused on supporting farmers at every stage of their sustainability journey to help them plan, make, and maintain regenerative management practices to improve the agronomic, economic, and environmental sustainability of your operation for the long term. So in other words, you sell bushels, you sell beef, you sell dairy, whatever you sell. What if you could sell rights to the carbon? In other words, what if you could also be sequestering carbon and get paid for it? It's a big market. There's a lot of confusion out there. Why don't you go to truterraag.com/enroll to find out. truterraag.com/enroll to find out more about what is admittedly kind of a confusing marketplace, but doesn't have to be. And it can be a place where you make money. All right, now let's talk about making money. Because if the reality is, if we're saying, isn't it bad that these poor young people can't get into production ag? You'd say, I don't know, man. Some years it might be a blessing. They're saving themselves from getting into a business where you struggle, work really hard, and maybe don't make that much. But young people can get in production agriculture. And I'm going to give you, again, some perspective. We have young farmer programs through the USDA, because that's the old question I would always ask. Well, a young person can't get into farming like you used to. I'm like, well, that's not necessarily true. Okay. There was always barriers to entry. Go back to whatever golden era you want, Grandpa. You want to go back to 1950s? Okay, my parents started farming in 1950s. They did, and they didn't come from nothing. My dad was basically a sharecropper. His dad milked cows for other people. Hired hand, herdsman's helper, if you will. My dad didn't come from nothing. My mom came from a little bit of something. They had some farming operation, not really worth a damn, and also got 8 siblings, and she didn't get any inheritance from that alleged farm operation until she was like in her 60s, mid 60s. So what are we talking about here? You say, all right, what was it like? Well, in the 1950s, my parents did have a little small farming operation. They kept chickens. They weren't big enough, even in the 1950s, they were not big enough to have a huge commercial laying operation. So they sold eggs locally, direct to consumer, had things like the convent in town that were customers, or the monastery. Yeah, people they were affiliated with because they were very Catholic in that small community. My parents also then in the 1960s got cows, started milking cows, something my dad knew because he grew up on other people's farms milking cows. He said, let's get some cows. And then you'd say, okay, well, then you did start out. So why are you saying that it wasn't something you could do back then? I'm telling you, it was a struggle back then. My mother worked, a few of us kids worked, like 12-hour days, labor-intensive, low budget, because we're absolutely on a shoestring, very undercapitalized. So it was done and could be done, but it was extremely labor-intensive, and also we did some what you'd call specialty stuff. My parents kept sheep before I came around, chickens, et cetera, et cetera. I just explained that to you. Rented ground that nobody else wanted. You see, it wasn't all that different 50 to 70 years ago. If you wanted to be in farming and you came into it young and undercapitalized, you had to do what nobody else wanted to do. You had to do the work that maybe wasn't so pretty. Farming rocky, crappy ground that was close to town that none of the big farmers wanted. In fact, it was owned by out-of-town landlords that were timber people, and they just wanted somebody to kind of keep a crop growing over there. Yeah, that's the story, even back in the 1950s to the 1970s when I came along. There's another part of that. Do you notice why I said they were direct-to-consumer before it was even a thing? Now, not the milk. The milk went to the local processor, and the milk processor would probably still take your milk, but that got kind of tight if you're small, if you're milking 50 or 60 cows, as opposed to now the major operations are bigger than that. And so some of the processors don't want to fool with smaller operations because they'd rather have great big ones. They have a more fixed supply, and they have less customers to deal with to get the supply they need. That's a reality of commodity production. But what if you did want to be small, and you didn't want to be small, but you had to be small because, again, commoditization makes it such that for you to compete and make money producing a commodity, you don't have to be hugely capitalized. Let's talk about my friend Andy Ambriel. He farms about 10 miles from me in Indiana. He's not an organic zealot, but he is an organic farmer. Yeah, he's really into soil. He's read about the regenerative farming practices, and he subscribes to many of them. But he got into organic farming because he was undercapitalized and a young guy, and he knew that he needed to make more dollars per acre because he wouldn't have as many acres, and he didn't have as much money to spread around to acquire acres that he could get less return on. You see, it still can be done in a niche. Andy is only in his 30s, and he's been doing this since he was 18. So you can start out in production agriculture, but probably not doing just commodity production. So what am I telling you? Andy's making money and did as a niche. My parents even struggled with this back in the old days. They relied on child labor like me, and they had a bunch of little things going on. Also, my dad had to work in town. That's right, all night at the railroad. You see, it can still be done today using the Andy example, and it was never so easily done back even 70 years ago as Grandpa wants to tell you it was. Another thing I'd like to point out. Today, there is more opportunity for niche agriculture than there has ever been. We did not have this thing called the internet 20 years ago or so, 25 years ago, right? We did not have a consumer base that was willing to go online and order their food. That came about 6 or 10 years ago and got an absolute shot in the arm during the pandemic. Now people sit around on their phone and just order up stuff. And there it is. It gets delivered. Nobody did this 10 years ago. Today, if you want to be direct to consumer, selling a niche product, you have greater opportunity and a more acceptance mentality in the marketplace than you've ever had. All right, I'll go another way. Is it really true that young people can't start in production agriculture? I just gave you examples of niches. I told you about being a smaller scale, not competing head-to-head on commodity production and going down the road of a specialty product. That was never an option 20, 30, 50 years ago, as much as it is now. Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, online. Go online. Just type in whatever you want to. Organic, grass-fed local beef, and you'll see endless opportunities. Now, granted, some of that's kind of becoming commoditized also because somebody said, I can do this bigger and cheaper, which is the way commodity production goes. So you got to find the next niche. Another thing to refute this whole notion that young person can't start out in agriculture anymore. There are more programs than people probably want to ever admit in our industry. You can go to the USDA and get a beginning farmer loan. And I want you to tell me where else you can do that. I quit corporate America as a 25-year-old. I just turned 25, quit corporate, and became a political comedian. I did not have any money. I had $5,000 in my 401k and was still paying back my college debt. I believe I still had a car loan too. Do you think I could have gone to any entity, let's just say the USDA, since the one we're all familiar with, and said, hey, I look a little bit like Bill Clinton and I've been funny since I was a little kid. I'm going to start a business out doing political comedy. Okay, where's your collateral? Well, I don't have any. I have a little bit of money in a 401k. Okay, kid, you know what? We're not going to loan you money for that. But in agriculture, you can go to the USDA office and say, Mom and Dad are going to give me 4 acres over here, and I have a contract, or I can get a contract with this pork integrator, and I want to build 2 pork barns. I'm going to need about $1.4 million to build these barns. I'm using rough numbers. Granted, I'm not in the vertically integrated pork business, so those numbers could be a little bit off, and I'm sure you're going to correct me, but the point I'm making to you is this. No other 22-year-old penniless kid can walk in and get a guaranteed loan to start a business. What if you said, hey, USDA, I'm 22 years old. Mom and Dad are going to be 4 acres. I want to build an asphalt shingle factory over here. What? Yeah, I'm going to need about $1.5 million loan. And also, I'm not going to pay competitive rate. Competitive rate is 8%. Oh, and you're going to let me get that money for 2% because it's government backed to start young people out in production agriculture? But I thought that was something that was impossible because of the corporate-ization of ag. You see where I'm going with this? You can't get a loan backed by the USDA for subprime interest to create any other commodity production in the world. Go in there and tell them you want to borrow money and you want to pay 1/3 of what real interest rates are to build a factory that makes steel conduit, a commodity. They'll laugh you out the door. Guess what? Nobody wants to give you money to start out a business as a Bill Clinton impersonator, political comedian either. At least they didn't back in 1994. You see where I'm going with this? Now, I just gave you the reason we should be optimistic. There's more niches than there's ever been. There's more opportunity for niche agriculture than there's ever been. You still can do it. I gave you an example of a guy who is doing it. He's a personal friend of mine. I'm not saying that, to rub it in, and he doesn't want to be resented by you. But the reality is there's all kinds of other people out here that are doing it. So what it comes down to is a lot of people don't want to evolve their thinking. They don't want to reinvent, and they want to believe that somehow it is still 1950, even though I just told you the 1950s weren't really the 1950s. Remember, my parents started in farming in 1950s, and guess what? It was very, very difficult, and they had to take a bunch of different roads to do that. Remember, I told you direct-to-consumer eggs, having your kids do the labor, having a dad that worked all night in another job, farming ground that nobody else wanted. Are you willing to do those things now? Maybe that's what it takes. Now, one other thing I want to share with you about reinventing, about evolving your thinking, because everything in life and business should be an evolution. Marketplaces evolve. Business evolves. The example you may have heard me use before was about 4 years ago. NPR did a story And it was like much of the NPR stuff, very left-leaning and very heartfelt, and it's tragic and crisis and everything's bad, and somebody's evil for making this happen. And they profiled two elderly people. I think they're in their 80s up in Wisconsin. And they'd been out there milking cows since the 1950s. And they were still doing it just like they always have in their 36-cow tie stall barn in the bottom of an old barn, bad ventilation. The cows were completely, I looked at the imagery because I was intrigued by the story that someone shared with me and said, isn't this sad? Because the story, of course, went on to say that these poor people aren't making any money. And luckily their son or daughter-in-law went and started a GoFundMe account so that they could still make it because they're being put out of business by factory farms. Now, did a factory farm really come and put them out of business? If you're still farming, if you're still doing what you did as the way you did it in the 1950s, maybe you should go broke. Also, I looked at the images. The cows were disgusting. Had manure caked to them all over them in that old barn. Didn't look like the cows at the dairy farm that I rent my farmland to. Go to that place, those cows are in great shape. They walk through foot baths. They've got a veterinarian on consultation. They've got nutritionists on consultation. They've got a herdsman or two on staff. They've got all sorts of air quality control. They've got fresh water every 100 feet in their barns. Oh my goodness. That's one of those factory farms, though, where they take good care of their cows, get twice the pounds per cow per day as grandma and grandpa out there in Wisconsin. There's 36 cow tie stall barn. What am I telling you? If you want to do 36 cows in your tie stall barn, first off, take better care of your cows. Somehow NPR didn't pick up on the fact that the cows look like shit. There's another thing I would like to point out to you. If you want to do that, you need to find a niche. Maybe you need to sell direct to consumer. Some states allow raw milk. Maybe you should bottle your own product. Maybe you should turn it value added into cheese. If you want to do small scale, it is still very possible. But you're going to have to do extra steps to add value. That's the nature of commoditization. I told you we were going to talk about corporate-ization, which is a misnomer that you can't start out in production agriculture ever again. And that's a lament that I have heard from a lot of non-forward thinking or non-innovative thinking people throughout my life when it comes to this business. It's also not historically accurate. I've given you a lot of data, everything from my own personal stories, my parental stories, and to historical perspective from my book, Food Fear, about when we hit peak farm and what's been happening since then. Corporate-ization, consolidation, the reality of commoditization. Then I talked about evolution. Smartest thing I heard out of Gabe Brown. He's the guy that's the regenerative agriculture guy. He spoke at a conference. He also says in his book, if you want to make small changes, change what you do. You want to make big changes, change how you look at things. In this episode, I want you to think. I also want you to be prepared with the data I've just given you and the personal anecdotes that I've given you to refute the person you hear at the diner who says, young kids can't get into farming like they used to. And then you could even throw this one out there. Hey, if this is true, as you say it is, which it's really not, again, I've just told you USDA programs, beginning farmer loans, beginning farmer programs. If this is really true and you feel this way, old timer, you know what you should do? You should take your entire net worth and bankroll the next young person you talk to who can't break into farming. Yeah, you've got some farm ground over there. It looks like it's worth 30% more this year than it was last year. It's worth a whole bunch of money. You know what you ought to do? Sell it for half price. Well, I'm not going to do that. You see, when the rubber meets the road, sometimes these people are just complaining about something, and they're not actually going to do anything to change it. I just gave you options for changing it. Niche production, using government programs, et cetera, et cetera. Also looking at things for what they are versus what you've heard people tell you they are. I'm Damian Mason. I hope I gave you some perspective here, and if I made you mad, I'm really sorry. But some things are just, they're true. And I just gave you some truth. Thanks for being here. Share this with someone that you know that appreciate it. I very much appreciate you being a listener. As I said, I'm sounding a little bit mushy. because it dawned on me here over this wonderful holidays that I just celebrated. I'm really happy, and I've got a great life, and I've got a great business, and that's because of people like you. So thank you very much. Till next time, it's the Business of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for being here. This episode of the Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Pattern Ag. You've heard me talk about Pattern Ag because I think it's a pretty cool concept. New technology that allows you to predict the problems you're going to have and therefore treat them before those problems cost you money. What kind of problems am I talking about? Pests and disease. Things like cordon rootworm, sudden death syndrome, cyst nematode, and a whole bunch of other bad things that happen out there in the field that can cost you money. Guess what? Pattern Ag will let you find out ahead of time if the disease or the pest pressure is there, and therefore you're treating it before it costs you any money. What a great concept. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to learn more about their product, their technology, how it can make you money, save you yield, and also where you can find a rep that can come out there and do the work for you. Pattern.ag.